I think as many of you know in the room, one of the distinguishing features of the Principles of Responsible Banking is it's actually the first sustainable finance framework, at least that we know of in terms of in a global sense, that actually has impact at its core, which is a fundamental aspect. And it's a fundamental change in terms of the concept of how we approach sustainability integration. And so banking signatories, the 325 I mentioned, the 20 plus here in Spain, are working on what does this mean? How do you integrate? How do you feedback and sort of develop the systems? We do have our tools to work and support members, what we call the positive impact tools to help put such systems in place. However, and of course, there's a lot of expertise in other parts of the finance industry, the investment industry, who, as usual, has been first, I think, in terms of building out the notion of impact, although, you know, in a fairly focused way, but brings a lot of expertise to the table. So what we're going to talk about today is actually not specific to the PRB. We're going to go wider, and we're going to talk a little bit more at the normative level. And I think we're going to talk, we heard a lot this morning around development on the disclosure space, and that's critically important. We're going to speak less about that. We're going to talk, some would say the next stage, which is not so much simply about your disclosures, but the management. Once you're able to measure impacts of your financing, lending, investment, insurance, et cetera, how do you actually manage towards making improvements? Increasing notions of positive impact, reducing negative impacts. And I think obviously similar to the disclosure discussion, there are a lot of challenges around methodologies. You know, what is the right way to do it? How do we get to common consensus exactly? And if we're not all speaking the same language, are we all just speaking gobbledygook, some would say? We don't understand what you're saying. What exactly are you asking for? What's the comparability, et cetera? So that has led to organizations in this space. Excuse me, I have to bloody security on these things. I have to do a two-handed approach to open my... So this has led to a number of organizations to work together to try to get common consensus, actors who are working in the impact and impact management space. And we're going to go into more detail of essentially of what this group has been doing. You know, I think for the last couple of years, you know, there is a sense of confusion. I think we have to acknowledge, and I think many of you know, sometimes concern, sometimes irritation in terms of what are we talking about. And this has been an agenda that's been developing maybe a little bit more quietly within UNEP-FI and within our members and in other places as well. But we believe where there is progress being made, and we heard this morning in terms of notions of interoperability, and essentially we don't need many frameworks. We need a few, but that are functional in terms of representing the types of externalities or the types of impact and in the double, single and the double materiality sense that we want to be tracking. So the group of peer organizations who have been working together more recently to try to help get some sense around this space is called the Impact Management Platform. And we're going to hear more about it. I think that the partners who've been working together, these organizations, they share two basic beliefs. One is that impact management, you know, is really at the center, a key to achieving societal environmental goals and needs. And this is really why it was put at the center of the PRB, which is definitely, I think, a new notion. Maybe in an idealistic sense, it's easy to understand, but of course, in terms of implementation, it's much more complicated. The second shared belief is that a complete, coherent, and interoperable set of norms and resources are needed to achieve this. If we can't come up with that, then once again, we're just, we're speaking in idealisms, and we're not actually able to make things decision useful. So, you know, I think as sustainability initiatives and experts, you know, we all have a common responsibility to try to figure out and to learn the same sort of language. And if we're going to be providing guidance to the markets and various types of stakeholders. So it's actually been my pleasure since November 2021 for UNEP-FI to co-found the Impact Management Platform, and myself, I co-chair it. along with my colleagues from OECD. And today it's our pleasure to sort of hold this session to give you a little bit of the depth of what's been going on between these organizations, to try to come up with these common set of methodologies, understandings of what exactly impact management is. So we're going to dive into it. I'm going to be joined by two colleagues, Carlota de Coelho, who's a Sustainable Finance and Advocacy Lead at BLab Europe. So if you could please come up, Carlota. And Careen, who leads our Impact and SDG team at UNEP FI. But first, maybe if we can get a sense of a little bit of how you're thinking about this concept. If I could get a bit of a show of hands, and we're going to put a question up on the screen. So if I could ask anyone, what's your feeling in terms of how has your understanding of sustainability and impact management changed within your organization, over the past few years? So can we get a bit of show of hands to see who feels there is confusion in their organizations over different terms and approaches? I get an idea. Who feels there's confusion today? Okay. Maybe I can reverse that question. Who feels there isn't confusion, that there's clarity in terms of how we apply this concept? Okay, maybe. Yeah. Okay, it's all in how we ask a question. Could I ask someone in the room, can someone give us an idea of how they feel? And actually, I'll out the person who speaks loudest. Dimitrios, can you give a little bit of impression within Piraeus? Yeah, exactly. That's what you get. Tell us, in terms of in Piraeus, this concept of impact management, how is it understood? And what are the positives and negatives, if you can say, in terms of early adoption?
Well, historically, we've been involved in setting up the tool with the Careen here. So we've tested it internally, first version and second version. We are grasping the understanding of what that tool actually means. I mean, there's one thing putting in the data, and then the other thing is getting the analysis, and the third thing is to understand that. So we are still grasping with that. I can't say that we have 100% clear view of what it means. However, we are using it in how we decide, what we're going to do, how it ties in with our, let's say, our targets, our climate targets or whatever, or other targets that we got. So it's slowly becoming a business, I could say so, tool. But definitely we're not there where I would be happy, 100%.
If I can go to the next stage, because of most of the transitions we're talking about here in Madrid are really about not what you do, it's how you help your clients do it. And so in terms of the ability to communicate with your clients on these issues, is this particularly challenging when you start to talk impact with them?
It is.
Putting you on the spot.
Well, you're putting me on the spot, but the other thing is, unfortunately, I have to be very sincere with you. It is a challenge. It is very big. Maybe banks can understand now what impact is, but when we talk about, SMEs, small companies, because that's where our business is, I think that, they need a bit more time to understand. Having said that, though, once with the floods and the big fires that we had in Greece, I think now it's becoming more of an issue. They're still understanding what the impacts of our actions are, the impacts of how investment can actually help or not help in this situation. So impact is something that we'll be seeing a lot more happening. There's more discussion, let's say, in amongst banks, and there's various meetings that are held on this issue of impact. But it is an issue to actually communicate clearly with clients at the moment.
Okay, great. Thank you, Demetrius. I would like to take another question, maybe from the insurance perspective. And by the way, I don't know if people have been watching the news, terrible news out of Libya today. The flooding there, they're saying thousands have perished. And so people are becoming numbed, I think, to these climate physical impacts as they occur.
The storm that hit Greece, it's exactly the same system.
Right. And so it says, there are obviously there are impacts in Greece, but there's something about resilience and the ability also to be prepared for such impacts.
Yes, Eric, I'm Deepak from Vitality in London. So coming at it from a kind of insurance perspective, and even more generally, all businesses, I think it comes to purpose and impact. So businesses that have a sense of purpose and know why they exist, I think can more easily relate to the impact element. And I'm sure many, if not all of you, are familiar with Simon Sinek's model of the what, the who, and the why. A lot of businesses know what they do. Some know how they do it, but not everyone knows why they do it. And if you know why you're doing it, I think you can express your impact much, much more clearly. So Vitality, our core purpose, our business was founded on a core purpose, which is simply to make people healthier. So if anyone ever asks me, what do you do, Deepak? I don't tell them I'm an actuary, because they would run a mile. But aside from that, I tell them we try and make people healthier. And from that, you start getting into a conversation like we had earlier, Eric. So I think, and aligned to that also, I think authenticity within the purpose, because people see through made-up purposes, and there's a whole world out there where businesses are looking to kind of find their purpose. So there's just some kind of starting comments, and I'm sure we'll hear some great things from the speakers.
Okay, very well put. And I think one of the things that most of us share in this room is impact is not about doing, specific, very interesting projects at the margin and then continuing. It's really about how you integrate the notion into your purpose, into the why of your business, and there it can become quite powerful. Okay, so thank you very much. So let's dive in, and as we said, this is not so much looking at the PRB and how it integrates impact. It's at the higher level in terms of organizations working together and progress that's being made. So actually, if I could first call on Careen, and you're going to give an overall presentation in terms of the platform and some of the work that conceptually that it's been doing. So Careen, can I hand it to you?
Absolutely, thank you. This seems to be working all right. So I think the idea behind kind of getting a sense of the audience and your reactions to what we call the sustainability or the impact landscape at the moment is, I think we certainly feel at the UNEP Secretariat that we often get a lot of questions around impact and the concept of impact itself, but also about the whole ecosystem of standards, frameworks, guidance, concepts, and terminology, and how they relate to each other. And so if I do this, is it compatible with that? And if I do this other thing, is it the same as if I do the other one? So this is a little bit what we're trying to address here. So just Eric mentioned the platform, but you may or may not have heard that much about it before. There have been a few webinars that the platform has hosted, but if you've missed those, just so you have a bit more clarity what we're talking about in terms of a group of sustainability initiatives, you should be seeing on screen there a collection of logos. It's basically the main, I would say, voluntary initiatives and sort of norm builders around sustainability issues. You can see there's a spattering there of types of organizations, some of them focused specifically on the finance sector, like UNEP, like PRI, others, kind of broader real economy remit, like the UN Global Compact, like B-Lab. We're very pleased to be sitting together on this panel today. And also, initiatives or organizations that will be focusing specifically on one dimension of this whole sustainability topics, that is disclosure. So you're seeing the likes of GRI, CDP also on this slide. And so, as Eric said, the idea is really to come together with this common belief that, understanding impact and managing impact is indispensable to achieving our societal and environmental goals, and therefore needs to be mainstreamed. But for that to happen, we also need to get our act together as initiatives to provide, a landscape that makes sense, and to provide a system of norms that is coherent and that is complete. And so, to sort of illustrate that, we've tried to represent a little bit what we're hearing day in, day out, a lot from, interacting with the networks of practitioners that are involved with all of these initiatives, saying, oh gosh, another piece of regulation, or, another disclosure framework, one more initiative. Oh, this one talks about capitals, this other one talks about dependencies, this one's doing valuation, this one's about rights, this other one's talking impact, sustainability, ESG. My head is exploding. Can you please figure this out and just all agree to something? So that's, you know, what we're getting. And I think this, you know, this platform of partners is saying, okay, I think people have a point. We do need to get our act together if we want to achieve our common mission. And so what we're trying modestly to start doing is work to, you know, something that is actually a system by design as opposed to a sort of a landscape by default, which is a little bit what we've got right now. And so you're seeing something that admittedly is a little bit small, but it's just to point you to one of the things that we've done, which is to try and actually map out the landscape in a structured way. That thing is called our system map. And effectively, one of the things it starts to do is not only distribute things as per a little bit the typology you saw on, you know, the previous slide. You know, there is a difference between obviously regulation, a voluntary code of conduct, a certification. So it maps out those different types and natures of resources, but it also categorizes them as per 3 key functions. And you're seeing, you know, the big bulk of it. Hopefully, if I can have the next slide again, Mustafa. Sorry, I'm being naughty. I'm moving about backwards and forwards with the slides. A big chunk of it is what we call practice. It's the actual management part of dealing with sustainability issues. There's another part that is specifically about communicating and disclosing. And then finally, we see almost a third circle or a third layer, which is benchmarking, rating, analyzing the results that we see, rating practice and performance. And so that system map has been one of the first things that we've done as a platform to try and do a little bit of sense making and also agree consensually, okay, this, you know, what is my place within this landscape? What do I do? What do I not do? And, you know, if you go to the system map on the platform website, you'll see that it has a number of tags to show the sort of audiences that it's for, you know, different things are for. It will also show something we'll go back to in a moment, which is materiality focus. It will also be quite specific in terms of, does it deal with, you know, all aspects of impact management or just some aspects? And so that is everything you'll find on the system map. But that is, you know, something that gives me an opportunity to go one step further to explain, you know, some of the rest of the things we've tried to do, which is to actually agree on some of the key concepts and terms. Can we have even a common understanding of, you know, what is impact management? And you're seeing here an extract of some of the key terms and concepts that we've basically developed a consensus view, definition, and explanation for. There's a series of those. You're seeing, you know, a little bit on the side, an extract there again from the website. Do treat this as a resource so that, you know, when there is a little bit of doubt around terminology or around certain concepts or how different frameworks fit together, hopefully this is a, you know, a resource that will help. But, you know, let's just look very briefly at the core of the matter, which is impacts and impact management. And so you can see, keeping it very simple, impact, the effects of organizations' actions on people and the natural environment. And impact management is the process by which, as organizations, we can understand, act, and communicate about that with the intention or with the effect that we'll be reducing negative impacts and increasing positive impacts. Intentionality, actually, I'm leaving that out because we'll be seeing later, Carlota will be speaking to all the nuances around that. But impact management basically is that, and that is the consensus view that, you know, UNEP, B-Lab, and all the others have reached. We've gone deeper than that to try and say, okay, let's unpack, you know, beyond a high-level definition, what does it mean? Because each of our frameworks, you know, we're saying, you know, we want you to do A, B, and Z, you know, be a B Corp, okay, well, that's going to mean you have to, you know, do a certain number of things. PRB, right, fantastic. You've got 3 steps, you've got, you know, an impact protocol, tools, a number of things, and with every initiative, it's the same, right? And so what we've tried to do is really map out impact management in a little more detail. And we've called that the actions of impact management. What you're seeing is just, you know, the animation from the website, because it's an interactive explanation of the different actions of impact management. And we can have I won't go into each of them in full detail, but if you go to the website, it does give you quite a detailed explanation of each of these actions, and then takes you and identifies to, you know, the resources that are relevant for that action and for a specific audience, so that, you know, you're not led to something that is, you know, specifically for an oil company if you're a finance company. So that's what we've got. But I'd just like to give you at least, you know, a high-level view of how we have managed to explain the actions of impact management in a consensual way across our organizations. And here you're seeing probably an echo to what we did in the system map, that we are distinguishing between things that are done at different levels. So first of all, what happens internally are basically the actions that each organization can perform within the organization and that get iterated over time. And that's really the center, the biggest part of the wheel going around. There are external actions that are performed by external players, supporting organizations, such as verification, assurance, certification, also benchmarking, rating. These things are all part of the landscape, of course, but they are external functions. And of course, there's the middle of the circle, which is how all of this informs internal governance and strategy, excuse me. So that is, let's say a first important structural conceptualization of what impact management is that all of these organizations have agreed on. If we look a little bit closer specifically at the internal actions, which I think are probably the most important for the audience today, there's an important distinction here again to be made between what is on the one hand the actual management per se and the communication around what you manage and the results you get out of that, the actual impacts that are delivered, the outcomes that are produced. So hence, coloring in that last item on communicate in red. But maybe I'll just very briefly now explain the main actions. You'll see that it's fairly intuitive. It's not, it's not rocket science. This will really remind you of just good business management to a large extent, which goes to show, the extent to which this impact isn't otherworldly in that sense. And then, we'd like to just illustrate how that relates to what we do at UNEP through the PRB, what happens at B-Lab. I'll be handing over to Carlota. And Carlota will also then be explaining a bit more how that also relates to some of the standards and regulation, because obviously this platform is uniquely composed of voluntary initiatives, but what we want to do by being more coherent and by having a consensus view is very much to inform the policy and the regulatory developments, because those developments are likewise affected by us potentially not being very coherent. If we're the forerunners, we need to have, a single voice and a more of a consensus view to offer. But let's first just summarize on, the actions themselves and focusing on these internal actions. So first of all, very important, identify. It's this notion of understanding, all impacts that are potentially associated with the organization, positive, negative, across all topics, indistinctively of whether it's environmental or social. It's just understanding basically what your, let's say, default profile looks like by virtue of the sector that you're in, by virtue of the geographies that you're in, by virtue of the types of products and services that you're in. A second step is the next action, measure, assess, and value. Obviously, it's not enough to understand the theoretical outlook. You need to understand, to measure what is your actual practice, what policies, processes you have in place, what are your actual results, what is your performance, what do we measure if we really look at the impacts that are delivered. Further to that, you're in a position to set targets, make action plans, prepare yourself for things to actually happen. We then implement what we've planned for, hopefully meet targets, but that's why we have monitor, learn, and adapt as a very important step, because this is obviously an iterative process, constantly iterating. And that is the basis on which one can communicate, and this probably does resonate with a lot of what is being requested in some of the new standards and so on, but we'll be going into that. So I'll just illustrate how this relates to UNEP and more specifically the principles for responsible banking, and then I'll hand over to Carlota. So here's a very high-level read across. Hopefully you're recognizing there on the right-hand side basically the methodology that UNEP has developed and which is embedded in the principles for responsible banking, where you're required to go through a number of steps aligned with the principles, starting with identification, impact analysis, moving on to the performance measurement and assessment on your most significant impact areas as defined by the impact analysis. And Dimitri early on was mentioning some of the tools that we've developed to enable that process. So as you can see, impact identification, performance measurement and assessment, this is very much aligned with the consensus view that we're seeing around the table with all the organizations. target setting. You'll recognize that as the next step in both, the requirements of the PRB and the impact protocol for banks, and further to that, the definition of an action plan and constant monitoring. So as you can see, it's really something that is starting to become a little bit more homogenized in that sense, and we're making steps hopefully in the right direction for things to be more coherent. But I'll hand over to Carlota to maybe explain how that works on B-Lab's side and to open up the horizons also to the sort of standards and regulatory scene as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Careen. My name is Carlota. I work for B-Lab, but also I'm a member of the technical expert group of EFRAG. And indeed, I agree with you. It's fairly intuitive. And now we're going to see that essentially when we screen through different frameworks, we're going to realize that we're following more or less the same logic. I will start with BCorp. For those of you that are not familiar with BCorp or benefit corporations, we are a movement of around 7,400 companies which have achieved the certification. But what I want to talk about more is the B impact assessment. So that's the assessment questionnaire. It's a closed questionnaire that companies may use. It's free, it's didactic. And actually for SMEs, it's a pretty good solution to get started on impact management. We have this off-the-shelf impact management tool whereby we give the ingredients. Now, for the strategy, we do ask the company to first define their purpose, their raison d'être. And then when it comes to governance, here we have a mandatory requirement where companies must hold themselves accountable to all stakeholders, and they have to do that by amending their articles of association and committing to generate benefits not just for the shareholders, but also for the stakeholders. Actually, since it's a standardized approach, we do the identification of sustainability matters for the companies. And here we have a set of, in average, 250 questions, which may vary depending on the industry category and the size of the company. Yeah, and there, well, we look at different types of indicators across different impact areas, qualitative and quantitative, your classic policies, actions, metrics, targets. And then once these companies have they've done a first self-assessment, they were referring to the questions which looks at your most recurrent, say, typically relevant sustainability topics, and then they can move on to measure, assess, and decide what they're going to put their focus on. So as they draw an improvement journey, they can actually download this roadmap, this action plan from the B Impact tool, and they set goals over a predefined period of time. They begin implementing, and they will most likely to not start with some low-hanging fruits, perhaps formalizing policies, writing and circulating a supplier code of conduct, but also by tracking metrics or key metrics, monitor water and energy usage, for example. No? And then they monitor. Companies do like that. The closed questionnaire and the fact that we give a weightage to each question and a scoring based on performance, it really allows to keep track of the improvements. Also, as we know, companies love to be, to compare their performance to their peers and to be benchmarked. And those companies that have achieved a score of 80 points may decide to proceed to the audits. They may just use the impact assessment tool as it is, but they may also want to go for the B Corp certification and therefore communicate what they have done in terms of sustainability performance. So that's for B Corp. We've begun with SMEs in 2007, and our role was really to evangelize mainstream impact management. And since then, what has happened is that larger well, yeah, there's certain traction was generated, and larger corps now want to have the same accreditation and sit at the same table as the best-in-class Patagonias, etc. So yeah, indeed, now I'm going to move to the ISSB. And now that we're going to talk about ESG disclosure frameworks, we have to think of it through the sustainable finance lens. Here, the purpose is different. What we want is to make available disclosures on those ESG data points that will help enable investors to vote with their wallets and reorient massive fluxes of capital. So indeed, it would be a very bad practice, but we could go straight from identifying the material topics to communicating them. From the ISSB standpoint, when we talk about materiality, we consider that the information is material when misstating it or obscuring it might influence, or might be reasonably expected to influence an investor's decision-making. So it's also known as the outside-in perspective. We look at how sustainability-related risks affect the business. No? Now, if we move to the next slide, we will see that actually the structure of IFRS S resonates and is fairly aligned with those actions of the these actions identified by the IMP, by the Impact Management Platform. We would start by looking at governance, those processes, controls, and procedures to manage sustainability-related risks and opportunities. At the strategy, then we move on to the risk management, understand the processes used to identify and prioritize, monitor risks and opportunities, and skip to metrics and targets. Now, it's true that even though we don't really have the implementation, and in the earlier slide we showed that, ESG standards, reporting standard setters, they don't prescribe behavior. They don't tell you that you have to develop policies, actions, dedicate resources. Nonetheless, if you don't, you're still going to have to report that, because that is material information. And if we move to the next slide, to the ESRS, where I was a little bit more involved, again, it's a very similar rationale. Actually, the chairwoman of the technical expert group, Chiara, she constantly reminds us that we do not prescribe behaviors. We only want corporates to make disclosures of a certain granularity. And this here, we introduced this, you've heard about this double materiality perspective, and we follow the impact materiality definition of the GRI. We look at severity, so scope, scale, and irremediable character of the impact. So then if we move to the next slide, we will see that again, standard setters talk to each other. We are working and we try to keep frameworks interoperable. That's why actually the ESRS originally had 3 different levels of information, and we've aligned to the TCFD and now the ISSB to have, again, these 4, main difference being that from a double materiality perspective, we have impacts, which you think was important when we talk about sustainability reporting. And I think we can move to the next slide and deep dive a little bit more into this piece by the IMP on materiality that unpacks, and I want to say also debunks, this exaggerated perception that financial materiality and impact materiality is so different from and so separate concepts from one another. If typically when we identify, when we try to identify and then we assess our impacts, we begin with idiosyncratic risks, not those impacts that would be most specific to us, looking at dependencies and other risks. So if I'm a farm, I need water for my crops. Therefore, I depend on a natural resource, which is water, and therefore I will begin probably by thinking about having some kind of water management practices, or at least a water management policy. The problem is that when we think like that, we are not appreciating that even very small impacts, well, an accumulation of small impacts can contribute to system-wide risks, no? Because ultimately all economic activity is embedded in social and environmental systems, and we all depend on the stability and the viability of these systems for sustained financial performance. No? So here we have the illustration on the slide, and we can understand that if we take an example of enterprise A, B, and C, who generate a negative impact on the people and the planet. However, only enterprise A and B have idiosyncratic risks associated to this impact. And yet, enterprise D and E might also be affected by this more system-wide risk that is, well, basically generated or contributed by enterprise A, B, and C. I think if we move to the next slide, we can see some examples. So when we think about income inequality, we can see that it amounted to 4.7 percentage points of cumulative GDP growth between 19 and 2010 in some OECD countries. So it affects us all. We also know that a partial collapse in select ecosystem services could cost up to 2.3%. Well, in US dollars, it speaks more, 2.7 trillion in global GDP. So again, it's a significant risk to our economies. And when we go to gender inequality here, it's more from the opportunity perspective that fully closing the global gender gap in the labor market was estimated to add 28 trillion to global GDP by 2025. So I think here with these examples, we understand this quite well. If we move to the next slide, I think what I particularly like about this figure is that we understand that when we introduce this notion of dynamic materiality, whereby, again, an accumulation of small impacts that are not immediately significant to an entity can become significant over time, we see that the gap is much closer between impacts materiality and the financial materiality perspective. And universal owners who have very diversified portfolios and long-term portfolios, they understand this concept very well because obviously their portfolios are very exposed to the systemic risks. No? So they have an interest of managing the impacts of their investees to avoid contributing to systemic risks. And now I'm almost done, I swear. Just to wrap up, looking at it from an impact management perspective, we'll understand that it's not just relevant for BCorp and companies that have a very social and environmental purpose, but every company, and especially those that are so concerned with the CSRD and with having to disclose, they will see that they will make their lives easier if they integrate impact management practices that will streamline their reporting. It will add meaningfulness to the reporting. So instead of doing a superficial data collection exercise, which can be burdensome on companies, there's a real opportunity to be seized to manage these risks and impacts, which, as the B Corp movement would evidence, is actually good for the bottom line too. So I hope that I have made a convincing case for impact management, and especially in the context of reporting. The reporting should just be an output of good impact management. I'll pass back.
Great. Well, thank you very much, Carlota and Careen. We're going to go to questions and thoughts on this, and I think, I don't think I want to oversimplify the challenge of getting all these organizations coming together to speak a common language, because it's not simple, as you would know well. However, I think having all of them at the table and these conceptual tools, for instance, this wheel, if we can get the organizations more or less aligned on the higher level concepts, then of course, how does it come down into how they're using these concepts? It will vary. But I think over time, particularly as we can have open discussions around, for instance, evolving notions of materiality, we can start to get to a place where we start to speak some common messages. So I'm going to put a first question out, but then I'm going to come to the audience. So please come up with your challenges. And I'm going to start with a little bit of the facetious question to Carlota. You work with thousands of organizations, of BCorps. What did they tell you about their efforts to raise financing? How do they get received? Do they feel when they're going to their banks or to their investors with their BCorp certification, what sort of reception do they get?
A warm reception because, well, we have already at this stage, it's been 15 years that they've existed, and we have compelling data. We have seen that B Corps grow by 20% on average annually. We have the lowest turnover rates, so access to capital is easier in that sense. And I would even say the other way around. Banks they have a problem with engaging with SMEs, and I think this tool, this wonderful tool, the B Impact Assessment, it helps to build bridges a little bit between a very confused SME who doesn't see the value in collecting data, and the bank who knows they need the data but doesn't really understand how to engage with the SME.
Okay, great, thank you, Carlota. Can I open the floor? Does anyone have views they would like to come in with? And what do you see? What looks fairly conceptually straightforward on the screen, but we know obviously it's when you try to apply it, there are a lot of challenges involved. So I see a hand at the back here. How do we dig into this? Do you see? Yeah, right there. If you could please introduce yourself and tell us, what are your thoughts?
Thank you. Thank you for this conference, for this talk. It has been amazingly interesting. My name is Salvador Doncel. I'm from an impact fund called Optimus Capital Partners. My question is, what's your take on the on comparability about impact? Not only same impact with the sectorial impact, etc., benchmarking. No, I'm talking here about how we can compare impacts on supply chain, human rights, gender gap with climate change. For example, to prioritize or to, for example, know what is relevant for an organization or not, and to know cumulative impacts.
Okay, challenging question. Careen, do you want to take that?
Sure, I can give that a shot. It's a very good question because we've heard already a number of times today. So what's the next topic? Should we be doing nature? Should we be doing social? Oh, yeah, it has to be nature, and social very close behind, and so on. And what that reveals is, and we know this, right? But we always want to forget it, which is that all these sustainability topics, they're interlinked. They don't come in separate pots. They're not unrelated. So that's why we end up, having very quickly to move on to the next topic. That's why we end up talking about just transitions, because if I just go straight into climate change and not take the other topics into account, I'm not going to manage. It's why the ESRS has the concept of do no significant harm, which also tries to just that. So I think, going back to the actions of impact management that were on screen a while ago with the wheel and the actions. The very first one, it says identify. And this identify step is really important because indeed, while everything is interconnected and hence it means you need to somehow have a holistic approach, there is no way you're going to be looking at every single thing and measuring every single thing and communicating on every single thing. That is just not going to happen. That doesn't make sense. It's not feasible and doesn't make sense. But you do need to have some better way than, climate change is everywhere, so I'd better do that, and something else happened, so maybe I should do that now. There needs to be you need to start from the perspective of, it all hangs together. I need a holistic system. And so what the consensus view on identification says is that identification process needs to be very rigorous in terms of understanding a number of key things. First of all, the associations that are linked just by the nature of the business you're in. So, the sector, basically. Each sector has its sort of, typical positive, negative impact associations. BCorp was saying, yeah, we kind of do that for them, so they don't have to worry about that. But sometimes it's not that easy, right? Because you can be in many sectors at once. So anyway, and as a bank, you've got clients in all sorts of sectors. Second thing is context. Okay, you're doing that, but where are you doing it? It's not the same if you're doing it in country A as country B, because the needs relative to those impacts are not the same. If you're water intensive in country A and country B, that might not have the same effect. If you're having, a negative effect on populations in an area where there are a lot of needs and where not, a lot of social needs are not filled, that is a problem. It's also a major opportunity. It means you've got a whole bunch of people who need a whole series of things. Why aren't you doing something about it? Surely that's a business, right? So understanding those two things and putting them together, getting the intersection between those two things, that really needs to be the starting point. There's then the overlay of measuring and understanding current performance, because obviously, you're probably not starting from scratch. You've already got some level of performance and you need to focus on the areas you've left out. But I think that starting in the right place and understanding the interconnections is really a key aspect. So I think that's been an important consensus building area, but it's still taking root in a number of the different frameworks. It's certainly one of the things we've worked on quite a lot in UNEP with the impact tools, but I don't know whether Carlota wants to say anything.
I think to translate this into the PRB implementation, there is specific wording, and those who work on PRB would know this very well, the wording around focus where it matters most. And so, banks, for a long time have been pretty good at publishing information on their paper consumption, their energy consumption. Not to say that those are irrelevant issues, but that's not where your maximum impact is. It's obviously about your client's energy consumption, emissions, et cetera. So there is a prioritization process involved. And the principles require that targets get set in the highest impact areas. And the process of deciding and disclosing where you as an organization feel you have the highest impact, it relates very much to where you do your business, which sectors and which geographies. So there's not a standard response to that. Now, that does not say that there are other issues that maybe are lower down in priorities that should be totally ignored. So the basic elements need to start to be put in place, but it requires a process within organizations to say we do need to start to be explicit with our stakeholders, with our investors, with our customers and our staff about where we believe we are having the biggest impact, positive and negative. So maybe that's a long-worded response, I think, to a difficult question, which doesn't completely answer what you're asking for. But I think it basically raises the issue around there's not a standard set of responses out there in the market. It really depends on who you are as an organization, who your customers are. Maybe we could have time for one or two more questions. Maybe we take them together if there are, and then we'll do a collective response.
Brilliant. Well done on the great work you're doing. I think it is absolutely necessary for progress in this area. My question is around, I suppose, the challenge of non-uniformity, and you've touched on this to a degree. So organizations may be very good in some areas, and you can think of certain sectors, for example, not to pick on anyone, but a tobacco organization, for example, which may be rated very highly. But what it says to the public, just in terms of some of the harms that they may be doing in other areas. So from a sectoral perspective, it's very difficult and clearly very complex. Could that actually lead to greenwashing risks and discredit the whole system and kind of make people put their heads in the sand saying, this is not working? So a tricky question, and I think is not easily answered, but how do you deal with those challenges?
Either want to take that? Maybe I can start by responding, and then Claude and Careen might add. I think this comes to the point of, not to out a tobacco companies, but once again, what they are doing on sustainability, I think many will be skeptical because their core product has very negative health outcomes. And so probably their largest impact, it's hard not to say that it is not on a health basis. And therefore, if you prioritize it, it's fairly clear, you know, as an investor or financier. I'm actually, next week, I'm very happy to join the 5-year anniversary of the Tobacco Pledge that some of your organizations are involved with, which was an effort to get investors and banks to be divesting, definancing the tobacco industry, basically for this reason. And so I think it's this prioritization, this notion, which hopefully should maybe clean up a little bit how sustainability or even ESG, CSR metrics are used. Not to say that it's simple, and you know, we get into industries like oil and gas, and then you start to ask the question, and we did hear this morning, you know, there was some saying, you know, we still need, now that's not a statement coming from myself, but some are saying that there is a need in the short term for continue or to work with these actors. I think for tobacco, for me, other than maybe the job implications, because some markets would talk about it's an important job creation industry, it's harder to see, I think, the dual, you know, some positive, some negative. But that's very much up to your organizations to try to understand and assess, prioritize, and try to come up with a decision based on that. I don't know, Carlota, or Careen, if you have anything to add to that.
Well, if I can offer a bit more of a Eurocentric perspective on this, I'm thinking we have standardized a little bit this do no harm threshold in SFDR, right? We have this annex with these so-called principal adverse impacts. And we understand that, well, right now, the EU carries a judgment against tobacco. Also, if quickly going back to the question of our other colleague, when determining where we should focus, because the level, I mean, the level of ESG maturity is still very, very low. So we want companies to manage all their impacts, but it's true that if we have to start somewhere, how do we do it? Do we use those 10 pies as a skeleton, as a sort of threshold for a minimum common denominator for do no harm? And then if we care about impact and a more tailored approach, we come up with some other indicators. I think these are both wonderful questions. And I think the theory of change of the EU, it's imperfect. Some days I wake up and I hate it. Some days I wake up, I still think, okay, it's imperfect, but it's still the most advanced regulatory landscape that we have.
I guess vaping would be the classic question. Is vaping good or bad? And I think, you know, one of the responses, well, if you have a regulatory framework which allows you to disclose the impacts, and I think one of the problems is many people don't actually understand the impacts of the industry today, then maybe or maybe it isn't better than tobacco. But so I think it comes really back to enabling environment. And once again, this is where Europe in most measures are out front. Although, you know, I'm not a smoker, but I have to say I do consume alcohol. And it's a question of what's the purpose of that industry? And of course, it is a slippery slope. There's a lot of consumption of different products, not all of them fully healthy, so how do we take that measure? But then you have, you know, industries and innovative solutions like yours, you know, which starts to, provide feedback and nudges and signals that can allow behavioral change. But we're actually coming towards the session. I would like to summarize up on some of the next steps. So could we actually go on to, we have a couple more slides. The focus in terms of the guidance that's being developed. And once again, this is a platform of organizations who are doing a lot, most of what they do is they do themselves. And this is just where you get together to try to get up with some common features. And you saw the wheel, and conceptually, I think it's quite powerful, but of course it's up to these organizations just to figure out how to apply it within their own specific industries and stakeholders. So that's really focused on the what, and that will continue to be developed. And as Careen mentioned, all of this is available online and trying to get to these partners' consensus views on what constitutes impact management from the different perspectives. Then we have the why and the how. and this most recent piece about looking at the imperative of impact management, looking essentially to try to, as we come, for organizations in terms of developing their sense of purpose, to try to clarify essentially what are they aiming for, and therefore is there opportunity in delivering on that, on who we are. And then in terms of the how, and Careen showed this system map and resource list. Basically, it's a mapping of all the different tools that are out there coming from different organizations, how they interrelate, how we are, efforts to make them interoperable to the extent that will take time, and guidance related to different aspects of implementing impact management. Next slide. So coming up next, more work around the normative, the terms, concepts, etc. New elements around system mapping, and trying to get a clarity. And I think we have to admit one thing is getting clarity and agreement, and a much bigger challenge is how do you get uptake within our own systems, our own work, and obviously most importantly within the organizations that we're supporting, the sectors, the industries. And so a lot of the work around mapping of sustainability, the nomenclature, and we had questions around just definitions. What is decent work? Conceptually, you get it, but when you start to define it, what is decent, and how does it vary depending on geographic or other contexts? Livelihoods, the same. Nature, as we've heard in other sessions today, a lot of energy around it, but we have to admit that we, within our membership, we see a huge uptick about the willingness to figure out, to learn, but there's also a lot of, there's still a long ways to go, I would say, in terms of the ability to set targets and to be as concrete as we are starting to see in the net zero space. And I think we all know reasons around that, data and otherwise, but certainly nomenclature is part of that. Essentially, yeah, let's agree on this common language and then apply it within our own sectoral applications. And as we look more towards standardization, classifications, ISIC, the jurisdictional classifications, we're not there yet. And we know that your organizations, many of you struggle with how these are applied. And so we will be working more, trying to at least make, I think it's in many ways, many small steps that can add up to a system that hopefully is more fit for purpose. I think that's what we have as our last slide. With that, a big thank you to Careen, to Carlota, and everyone involved within the UNEP membership and more broadly in terms of stakeholders to try to get clarity. This is definitely path making. I think Europe is out on front on these issues, but of course, unless we can get global uptake, and that's part of our mandate and our work, unless we can help translate these concepts around the world, it will stay a regional development. And I think we need to go beyond that. But I think there's some very important first steps. The organizations you see on the IMP are much more than European, although there's some very strong Europeans at the core. So the work continues. Please take a look at the resources on the website, and we look forward to working with you and contributing as you lead and we support, and we try to build a better system together for a future of impact management and more. Thank you very much. Looking forward to the sessions tomorrow.